This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of the Parish of Sacred Heart and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. So we have a question. Who is God? That's a question asked naturally by a child to his mother. Well, maybe not if there's no exposure to God talk or to the notion of God in the house, but any child who goes to church and who hears something about God is bound to ask the question sooner or later. And when the question is asked, mom will spend some time trying to answer it, along with all the other questions the child might ask as he's filling in the blank parts of his world. This is one in which the information provided is important and necessary. It's important and necessary for all of us believers as well. At this time in our history, we're all searching for the right answer to this central question. Answer it wrongly, and the world might cease to believe. Come up with the right response, and belief will seem not only natural, but necessary. In fact, any talk about the reality of faith always begins with a discussion about what we understand of God. But first, a few stories. When I was ordained, Father Frank Wrigley was the pastor in Woodward. I'd been in the parish of Guyman for 8 months as a deacon, and when I drove back and forth to Guyman from Oklahoma City, I would stop in Woodward to visit. Over this time, I began to come to know Father Wrigley and appreciate his wit and experience. Frank, at that time, had been ordained for about 30 years, which seemed an impossibly long time to be a priest, and he was filled with the accumulated wisdom of the decades. He talked about his years as a priest and all of the changes he had experienced, especially during his time through the tumultuous 60s. But he loved his vocation and treasured the priesthood he had been entrusted. At my ordination, he presented me with the 2-volume set of the theological work Catholicism by Father Richard McBrien. Inside the front cover he wrote, quote, "On the occasion of your ordination to the priesthood, may it be the most reasonable decision you've ever made," unquote. He didn't know when it was written, but that it would become his epitaph for me. Father Wrigley was trying to highlight an aspect of the life of the faith he thought most important in our day and time. It was one he had had a particular sensitivity to because he felt that in his life it had not much been appreciated. He was concerned that the life of the faith should be reasonable and logical, a product of the mind and the working of our intellect, and not simply an emotional or emotive response to the movement of the Spirit among us. While you might wonder at what kind of life Father Wrigley had lived up to that time and how the life of the intellect had been undervalued in his history, but suffice it to say, that was his personal concern. He wanted to be sure we approached the questions of faith in reasoned and thoughtful measure, not simply by going along with the fervor of the crowd. And thus, he wanted my decision for the priesthood and my embrace of it to be the most reasonable thing I had ever done. Our understanding of God and the presence of the transcendent in our world should carry with it the same imperative. It is possible to talk about the work of God in the world and the experience of God through the ages, from the great saints to the great sinners, and sometimes those were the same people, in terms of how they were carried along and sometimes carried away by their experiences. But this kind of talk can mislead. As we begin, it's important to try to talk in the most reasonable way about what we mean and what we know. God's not just an idea, just as the existence of your mother isn't an idea. But when we talk about either or both, we do end up talking about the meaning of their presence among us, and the conversation about meaning always involves purpose and ideas. And another story. When I was a child and visiting my grandmother in Okarche, I used to enjoy looking through her copy of the Bible. It was a normal-sized Bible, not one of those giant display versions, and it had in it a series of reproductions of pictures of famous biblical stories. Most of them were old Baroque paintings with flowing robes and dramatic scenes involving people I had not heard of before. There was a painting of Sarah and Abraham and the angels who visited them and enjoyed their hospitality. I remember another painting of women in billowing garments set in a wheat field. They were Ruth and Naomi, ready to greet Boaz. The most disturbing painting was of Jesus in the desert being tempted by Satan. In this work, Satan had horns and a tail and was painted all black. It was creepy and uncomfortable to look at. All in all, the paintings were forgettable. At least they didn't hold my attention for very long, except for one, and it was the first of the series. That one was a woodcut by William Blake, and it was called Creation. In it, God is portrayed as a man with gray hair and a long gray beard with a young, vigorous face. In the picture, God has stretched out his arm, and from his hand there were rays of light and lightning bolts going forth from his fingers. The understanding was that the power of God had created the world in an act of incredible energy. All was formed through this desire to create. And looking at the picture, I was entranced. First of all, because it was a story that I knew. I knew that God had created the world, and this picture of it was additional information. It allowed me to visualize what I had only heard about. And secondly, I was entranced by the idea of light and rays coming off God's hands. The anthropomorphism of the portrayal of God didn't bother me, like it doesn't bother most children. I had no problem thinking of God as a man at work doing amazing things or creating everything out of nothing. As C.S. Lewis points out, children have no problem imagining a toad or a teddy bear being characters in their world, while at the same time knowing a teddy bear in their bedroom and the toad in their garden is not that sort of character. God could act and do and create through moving his hands and his will. I was easily convinced the picture showed what God was like, although as a child, I knew this wasn't some kind of portrait of God or that God had to stoop down and stretch out his hand to do the things that were done. At the same time, looking at this woodcut, I was prompted to think of my grandfather. As in the picture, my grandfather had white hair, like God did. He died when I was 5, and I was older than that when I discovered this picture for the first time, so he was kind of a real presence in my life, although he was invisible. And certainly he was spoken of all the time. And I understood he'd been present in the lives of the people I knew and was around, and he was a man of power. I didn't think he could make things happen or that he was somehow superhuman. But when my mother talked about him, she sometimes talked about how he would get angry and often how sometimes bad things could happen if you didn't do things the right way. And to be honest, that was how people talked about God. So in my very young mind, it didn't take long for me to associate God with my grandfather. His picture, what I remembered of him, became for me the picture of God. And this picture remained with me for a long time. I didn't think he was God. I knew that God was vastly more and greater in every way than any person or any image anyone could have of him. Like teddy bears and toads, I knew what I had in mind was not that kind of character. But at the same time, what I had in mind was a way to understand and relate to the word we use in common conversation, in common understanding. Of course, God is not my grandfather. And even when I thought of his picture, when I thought of God, I knew God wasn't my ancestor who lived in the sky. My grandfather was a referent, a stand-in for my way of thinking. It's not that unusual. We're always looking for some way to grasp and understand while we're seeking understanding. And we shouldn't be afraid to acknowledge what we do and how we do it. The only caveat is to know that we're doing it. That is to say, we have to understand that we're using our imaginations to provide us with a way into comprehension, and it's not a substitute, and that we shouldn't substitute the image for the reality. The word for this is analogy. We use one set of understandings to give us a window into understanding something else. So, for example, when the psalmist says, "All flesh is grass," he's inviting us to understand the brevity of life. Just like grass comes and goes in a season, so a person's life, even if it's 70 or 80 years, comes and goes in a season. Flesh isn't grass. It's not spread out over a pasture. It's not to be consumed by the animals who are grazing. But in its brevity and its similarities and lack of distinctions, the human person can be said to be like grass. I know that's a weak example, but you get the idea. One image describing one kind of experience is used to describe another sort of experience. This is also called art. As long as we keep what we're trying to do in mind, it can be truly productive. We can begin to appreciate and understand in all sorts of ways. Take, as another example, using the word Father to describe God. This is a word we all understand and know. There's a word for father in every language, in every mode of expression, since there are fathers in every place. And if we understand a couple of things about a father's love, then our use of the word can inform and even delight. Of course, that means that we understand what we're doing and what the limits of our usage is, the limits of our analogy. Because we can always take things too far or not provide the limits for our quest for understanding. We can invest too much in the brief flash of insight and then get lost in the details, as if we were trying to talk about blades of grass and their relationship to flesh, rather than understand the brief window of life we suffer. This is especially the case when we use the word Father for God. In the course of our history, all kinds of people have lost themselves in this word and have presumed that God as Father described necessarily God, a man. How many times have you seen the image of the Trinity as an old man in a white beard above the cross, with Jesus on the cross and a dove above the head of the old man? It's a pretty crude analogy of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and is at best a simple, childish image. But in this image, as in the one by William Blake, God is imaged as a man. After all, God is called Father by lots of people, especially Jesus. Why wouldn't we think of the divine as male? Except that's not the whole story. God as Father is an analogy to the experience of fatherhood, a brief insight into what God is like, not a definition or a description of godliness. In this, the feminists have had it right. They complained that all through our history, most people, and they mean mostly men, have presumed God was male. Even when it says in Genesis, for example, that God made humanity in the divine image, male and female. Their righteous complaint is that too many people have held on to this image too long and too strongly, and have made God into the man God is not. And they added the complaint, if God is a man, then all men are gods. It's a reminder of the limitations inherent in our language, and it's a good one. Of course, that's not the whole story either. Annie Lamott, in response to the feminist authors, said they had a congenital poetry deficit, which, if you don't know, is not a compliment. She thought the feminist critique was too harsh and too narrow, because the title of God as Father allows us a true insight into the divine that is important for us to hold on to, rather than to complain about. We should allow its limits, but we should also allow ourselves to learn from it. Because when we call God Father, we're invoking a specific understanding that's important. In the history of the world, a father's love is different than a mother's love. We only have to distinguish the most basic physical characteristics to understand this basic insight. A child is the product of his mother. Without doubt, when this child is born, everyone knows who the mother is. There is no question and no obfuscation. This child was conceived in, carried by, and born from the woman that is this child's mother. And a mother's connection her love for his child is natural and axiomatic. It may be she does not love her child, but as a mother does love her child, it is because it is her child. But a father's love is different. Before the advent of DNA tests, which happened about 15 minutes ago, there was no way to prove beyond absolute doubt whether this particular man was this child's father. No one could prove it completely and totally. This was one reason that every culture developed sophisticated protocols to make sure everyone understood that a woman had restricted contact with other men and restricted opportunities to muddy the water of founding a child. This wasn't just to control women. It was also to strengthen the community of bonding and support. A man could never know for sure if the child he was raising was his own. The existential reality of his acceptance of his child is that it is a statement of his initiative, his claim on the child. So when he says, "This is my child," he does so as his willingness to invest himself in the child. Although he can never know without a trace of doubt, he takes the child in his arms and says, "I claim this child as my own. I choose." God's love is the love of a father for his children, rather than the love of a mother for her children. Not to denigrate mothers, it's to lever the experience into our claim for how God loves us. The word father, rather adorning God with male physiognomy, is to enlighten us with the understanding of God's profound desire to choose us and to make us the inheritors of the divine promise. It's actually a beautiful and powerful insight and a touching window into understanding God. But all language we use suffers from the same limitations. We're always striving to use our words to find the kernel of insight they offer as we strive to understand. And it's true, much of the talk about God is balled up into very abstract philosophical ideas. But at the same time, we're always striving to find the word pictures, the analogies of our experience that will help us to capture what we mean and communicate what we understand. It's an endless quest, but it's a necessary one. We should also take a lesson from C.S. Lewis about the pictures that we end up using. When we talk about the sophistication the average child has about how to understand the power of stories and the characters in them, he knew that their delight in the stories they read was also a part of the experience of their stories. They might read about great horses that could talk and fly, as well as toys that come to life and lizards that lead rebellions. But they know that these are different than the average livestock and stuffed animals they're around. But they understand that these stories are a window into an imaginative possibility that is present in all of these animals and toys that surround them. They look at a toad and imagine the possible story there, which is why when they read The Wind in the Willows, they will suspend their disbelief and think about a frog who wears suspenders and drives a car. They don't know any such toads personally, but they do know the delight in imagining there could be one. But their delight brings them to a limit as well. Lewis describes how difficult it is for small children, for example, to be impressed by a magician. Very small children, he says, are so delighted to know that a rabbit actually exists that they're unimpressed with the fact that somebody can make one appear in an empty hat. Magic tricks are no good when delight is everywhere and surprise is the definition of life. When we think of God, we have the chance to jump into this kind of delight. We have the chance to engage the word pictures we have and the experience that animates us in order to understand and to know what God is like. Over and over again in stories and in art, we strive to encounter God and understand how the divine is present to us. The more we explore the presence of God in our lives, the more the possibility of delight fills us. This has been one of the great breakthrough aspects of our culture at our time. We have dreamed imaginatively of God's presence and have filled ourselves with a measure of delight that was missing in many other ages. At the same time, just as in any other age, we have to keep our guard up and not let our imaginations run away with what we know. We always face the same challenge of keeping our word pictures clear and our expectations sharp, so that our true insights about God are not bled into the excesses of art. It's always a problem to imagine that our delight in a picture is supposed to be for the object the picture shows us, not just the picture itself. It's something like the warning from the Zen master who points at the moon and tells his disciple to look. The master then chastens the disciple to look at the moon, not at the finger. Look at what's pointed to. That's the challenge when talking about God. In the course of thinking and talking about God, there is one mistake that has accumulated over the centuries that has plagued much of the understanding about God in our common vocabulary. This is a problem that is much mentioned in the professional literature, but has not gotten out into the regular conversations we have when it comes to the back and forth about belief in God in our skeptical culture. It's the product of our faulty imagination, as well as the willingness to let our eyes set too long on an image rather than have them move on to what the image represents. We spend too long looking at the finger, not at the moon, when it comes to talking about God in our day and time. And the mistake is this. When talking about God, we often end up talking as if God were the apex of things, the biggest thing there is in the world we know. Sum up everything, and at the top of everything, there is God. That's a simple way to say it, but many of the descriptions of God end up this way. It's not that much different than saying that among all of the warriors in the world, God is the greatest warrior. Or among all the makers of things in the world, God is the greatest of all makers. Or even in a more luscious and imaginative vein, among all the lovers in the world, God is the most intimate. The list of things is endless, but the insight is the same. God is the apex of what we know and experience. We know where this comes from. By analogy, we understand God to be the greatest among all things. But we have to watch out. Our words can trap our understanding and then trap our expressions. Because if God is out there, the greatest of all, then the divine is one thing among other things. And in our world, which is fascinated at looking at everything, when looking and not finding God among all those things, the conclusion reached is that God isn't there. The thundering conclusion from those who peer into microscopes or particle accelerators or radio telescopes is that God just isn't there. But God is outside of such considerations. All descriptions are a way to picture. They're not a roadmap of location. All God talk has to presume God as the basis of all things, the sum of which is not God, but is still found within all God is. It's like imagining the love of husband and wife is calculable with a tape measure because you can use a ruler to measure the size of their rings. The presence of God is outside the scope of looking because there would not be the God we know if the divine could be measured so. There's a lot more to be said. Just remember, our language reveals a reality we all strive for and we all know. God is the presence we are all hungry to get, a presence that's just beyond our grasp. Hold on to that, and the gift of God is under our tree. We only have to unwrap it. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called, I'm Sick. I'm sick. Don't bother me, he said, groaning quietly. What I want now is sleep. Just go. Withdraw without a peep. Fever brings a heavy weight. Seems impossible to extricate one's self from the slide where time and energy collide. Healing is finally the bridge to community's high ridge. To return to the flock from stuffy illnesses block. I'll have to wait until then. When I'm better, that's when. Call me later on today. Tell me then about the way I'll live and carry on now when all life will then flower. Until then, I'm sick. So leave now. That's the trick. That's I'm sick. Living Catholic is our opportunity to continue to explore what it means to live this adventure of the faith that we have all been entrusted. I hope that in the weeks to come you can join me as we continue to explore what it means to be living Catholic.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.